The Obama administration's strategic rebalance towards the Asia Pacific has been described by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton as a pivot towards new global realities. Foremost among these global realities is, of course, the rising power of China. And in response to this, and in addition to other factors, of course, the rebalance strategy calls for the repositioning and the reorientation of a broad range of assets. And this will help facilitate the projection of U.S. power and the sustainment of U.S. presence in the Western Pacific. The pivot's been praised for sort of focusing the U.S. on potential future threats, but it's also been heavily criticized for reifying tensions with China. In response to this, what was called the pivot was sort of re-represented as more benign rebalance. And it's also worth noting that there have been a number of times over the last few years where politicians and pundits have declared the pivot to be entirely dead, largely as a result of sequestration. However, this doesn't actually seem to be the case. The 2014 QDR, which came out earlier this year, noted that the pivot is still a U.S. priority, and there's been a few actions recently that have indicated that it is certainly moving forward. Most recently, in the last few weeks, we've seen the USS Fort Worth, which is a littoral combat ship, deploy to the Western Pacific, and it's there to directly support the rebalance strategy. At the start of the rebalance in late 2011, about 50% of the U.S. Navy's 286-ship battle force was based in the Pacific. Currently, we look at about 60% of the U.S. submarine fleet, and about 53% of the U.S. surface combatant fleet is now based in the Pacific. So we're already seeing some increase there. What makes this basing arrangement important is how much force it can project into the Pacific Ocean itself. And the current arrangement allows the U.S. Navy to keep about 50 ships at sea at any given time. Looking ahead, by 2020, the U.S. Navy aims to have 60% of its 308-ship battle force based in the Pacific. This will facilitate an increase in daily presence from the current 50 ships to about 67 ships. And of particular importance, the U.S. Navy is establishing a forward operating base in Singapore. This is important not just because these ships are forward-based, but also because it's sort of redistributing the balance of force in the Pacific, moving a lot of the force down from the northwest down to the southwest region, which is increasingly important in light of moves by China in the South China Sea. The most important feature of the U.S. Navy's rebalance is forward basing. Without forward basing, the rebalance wouldn't have nearly as large an impact. It's important to consider it this way. A large number of the ship movements that we're expecting to see over the next few years are actually intra-Pacific, so we're not going to see a change in the balance between the Atlantic and the Pacific. In addition, even in the long run, the overall increase in vessels in the Pacific will only be about 10 ships. However, it's still important because these assets are being shifted forward, as I already mentioned. For example, a lot of ships that are in San Diego are going to be moved to Japan and Singapore. This is important because it enables the U.S. Navy to keep a larger presence in the region, because forward-based ships, they can stay at sea and be deployed a lot longer than ships that are based in the United States. This time at sea is further enhanced through the use of rotational crewing. For example, the littoral combat ships are going to use a 3-2-1 manning concept. What this means is there's going to be 3 crews for every 2 ships, and this is going to enable 1 ship to be continuously forward deployed. The USS Fort Worth, which is currently deployed in the Western Pacific, is testing out this manning concept, and we expect it to be deployed for about 16 months. This is twice the length of a normal U.S. Navy vessel deployment, and by some accounts, it's actually the longest deployment of a U.S. Navy vessel in about 40 years. In addition, while it's deployed, the USS Fort Worth will be utilizing a number of expeditionary maintenance stations. This is important because it's helping to build a logistical capability to support these increasingly long deployments. Overall, this forward basing, along with the rotational crewing and the in-theater logistics, is the reason that we can see an increase from 50 to 67 vessels on a daily basis, despite the very small increase in actual number of hulls in the region. Think about it this way: if these ships that were forward-based were instead based on the western coast of the United States, the U.S. Navy would actually only be able to increase its presence from 50 to 54 ships. So by forward basing, the U.S. Navy is essentially getting about 10 ships at sea extra than it could otherwise maintain. Looking at the aerospace domain, the U.S. Air Force is aiming to have about 60% of its overseas fighter planes based in the Asia Pacific by 2020. However, the focus of the U.S. Air Force is on places, not bases. What this means is that there's not so much an emphasis on increasing its permanent presence in the region, but instead they want to rotate more assets through the region on a more regular basis. For this reason, we've seen a lot more squadrons deploy to Japan, South Korea, and Guam. In addition, the Pacific Air Force is testing out a Rapid Raptor concept. This will see much smaller detachments deploy rapidly to forward locations. What this is helping to build is, again, a logistical capability. These forces are going to actually operate increasingly out of new locations as well. We can expect to see them in Australia, in the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia, whereas it used to be predominantly up in Japan and Korea. Therefore, again, we're seeing that shift from the Northwest Pacific to the Southwest Pacific. The U.S. Army in many ways is kind of a forgotten partner in the Pacific rebalance, but the U.S. Army is actually adopting its posture in line with the guidelines of the rebalance strategy. For example, the U.S. forces in Korea were reinforced by one maneuver battalion in early 2014, and the permanent brigade that's been stationed in the Korean Peninsula for many, many years, decades, is now going to be replaced by a rotational brigade, and that's going to happen by mid-2015. Again, this is important because it's building a logistical capability to move forces in and out of the Pacific theater very quickly and on a routine basis. In addition, there's a number of other programs that are building the Army's capability to operate in the Pacific region. If we look at one in particular, it's called the Pacific Pathways Program. This program was started in 2014, and it saw one battalion deployed to 3 different exercises within the Pacific theater, all of them in a row, so it would not come back to the United States and reset, but deploy from one place to another. This was important because it was building a logistical capability, and it's also building relationships and interoperability within the region. Meanwhile, the U.S. Marine Corps, for its part, is also increasing its rotational presence in the region. It stood up a 2,500-strong Marine Air Ground Task Force that's going to rotate in and out of Darwin, Australia, where it's going to have pre-positioned equipment. They're also going to rotate more forces through the Philippines, and some permanent forces are going to shift from Okinawa to Guam. So again, we're seeing that shift towards the Southwest Pacific. So overall, if we take into account the air, the sea, and the land domains, it's clear that the emphasis of the Pacific rebalance is on logistical capability. And it's this logistical capability that will enable the U.S. to project force into the region if and when there is any type of conflict or need to do so.